So I want you to think about the last time you had to deliver just a massive high stakes presentation. Or, maybe you had to lay down some really difficult ground rules for your team or even your family.
Oh, yeah. That is exhausting.
Right. It totally is. Usually
Yeah.
when someone delivers a heavy, life-altering speech like that, the very first thing they do afterward is take a massive breather.
Yeah, you step back, you kind of, well, you let the crowd process what you just said.
Exactly. You retreat to a quiet room, maybe grab a coffee, and just recover your energy.
It's just human nature, honestly. A major declaration of authority, it takes a toll. You need space for those ideas to actually settle into the minds of your audience.
Yes, which is exactly why the Gospel of Matthew is so fascinating right at the specific moment in the narrative.
Oh, absolutely. The timing is incredible.
Because right after Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount, which, regardless of your religious background, is universally recognized as one of the most famous, demanding ethical teachings in human history, he doesn't retreat.
No, he really doesn't.
He doesn't go take a nap in a cave. He just walks straight down that mountain and immediately launches into this relentless, hands-on campaign,
Yeah.
right into the absolute messiest parts of human suffering.
It is a brilliant narrative shift on Matthew's part. If you are sitting there listening to us today, what you're about to see is a very deliberate transition.
Right.
We are moving from Jesus demonstrating his authority in word during the sermon to proving his authority in deed.
And unpacking exactly how he does that, that is our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a fantastic exegetical commentary on Matthew chapter 9.
Yeah, written by Mark Bates for Rabbit Room Apologetics. It's a great piece.
It really is. And the core focus here, the big idea we want to pull apart for you today, is how Jesus uses physical healing, and specifically the forgiveness of sins, not just as random acts of compassion.
Right, they aren't just isolated good deeds.
Exactly. He uses them as undeniable, absolute proof of his divine authority. He's basically showing the world that he actually has the right to rewrite the rules of reality.
It's crucial to understand the architectural framing that Bates points out here. In Matthew's Gospel, chapters 8 and 9, they function as a distinct, carefully constructed unit.
Like a package deal, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus just gave the ultimate kingdom Torah, so to speak, on the Mount. And now Matthew presents a sequence of 10 specific miraculous works. And, that number 10 is definitely not a coincidence.
Okay, well, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because Bates brings up this idea of a Moses typology.
Right.
And for anyone who hasn't spent, years in a seminary, what does that actually mean? Because from what I gather, ancient Jewish writers didn't just write strictly chronological history. They looked for repeating patterns, right?
Precisely. Yeah, typology is essentially a literary and historical pattern where a later figure echoes or fulfills the blueprint of an earlier one.
So history rhymes.
History rhymes. I love that. Yes.
Okay.
And for a first-century Jewish reader, the ultimate foundational story is the Exodus.
Of course. Moses and Egypt.
Right. Moses, acting as the mediator of the Old Covenant, was the instrument for 10 plagues in Egypt. And those 10 plagues were, they were demonstrations of God's power to deliver Israel from physical and political bondage.
Okay, so if Jesus is stepping onto the scene, claiming to bring a completely new covenant, he basically needs to match or exceed that original blueprint.
Yes, he does. But notice the incredible inversion happening here.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of 10 plagues of judgment to destroy an empire, Jesus performs 10 miracles of restoration.
Oh, wow. That's a huge shift.
It really is. He's delivering people from the internal bondage of disease, demonic oppression, and sin itself. These acts aren't standalone magic tricks meant to just wow a crowd.
Right. They mean something bigger.
Exactly. Bates argues we should read them as historical down payments.
Okay, down payments on what?
On the ultimate restoration. Every time Jesus heals a shattered body, he is providing a localized, undeniable preview of a cosmic renewal that is eventually coming to the whole world.
Man, that is powerful.
But, and this is the absolute key to reading Matthew chapter 9, you have to watch the mounting tension.
Right, because as his authority becomes more obvious, the pushback gets significantly more aggressive, doesn't it?
It does. Every single time Jesus reveals a bit more of who he is, the official opposition from the religious leaders, the scribes, and the Pharisees, it just grows more entrenched.
Because they are the guardians of the status quo.
Exactly. And he is an absolute earthquake to their entire system.
Which brings us perfectly into chapter 9, where that earthquake hits a very specific, intimate little room in Capernaum.
Yeah, great scene.
We move from the wide lens view of the mountain down into this incredibly crowded house. A group of friends brings Jesus, a paralyzed man, literally carrying him on a bed.
They are desperate.
So desperate. They want their friend to walk. And I have to be honest here, I have always struggled with how Jesus handles this scene.
Really? How so?
Well, the friends go through all this intense effort, right? The man is lying there completely incapacitated. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Take heart, my son. Your sins are forgiven."
Yeah, it's a jarring moment.
It feels incredibly tone deaf to the man's immediate physical pain. I mean, it's like an emergency room doctor walking up to a patient with a shattered femur and saying, "Good news, your credit card debt is cleared."
That is a great analogy.
Right. It just seems like the completely wrong priority, almost like he's making a detached theological point at the expense of this guy's very obvious, very immediate bodily trauma.
I completely understand why it feels that way to a modern reader.
Yeah.
I really do. We tend to strictly compartmentalize the physical body from the spiritual life.
Yeah, we keep them in separate boxes.
Exactly. But in the ancient Jewish worldview, those things were deeply, deeply intertwined. Sickness, suffering, the fallen state of the world, they were all seen as downstream consequences of humanity's broken relationship with God.
So it's all connected at the source.
Right, so by addressing the sin first, Jesus isn't dismissing the paralysis at all. He is diagnosing the much deeper, invisible root of all human suffering. He is addressing the absolute bottom of the issue.
Okay, I see that. But the scribes sitting in the room, they don't see it as a brilliant diagnosis.
Not even a little bit.
They see it as a massive theological scandal. Because, as Bates points out in the source, in Old Testament theology, granting covenantal pardon-like, the actual authoritative wiping away of sins against heaven, that is a prerogative reserved exclusively for YHWH.
And that right there is the crux of the tension. It's one thing to be a prophet who says, God has forgiven you.
Right, like passing on a message.
Exactly. It is an entirely different, terrifying thing to look at someone and say, I forgive you.
Because you're claiming to be the offended party.
Yes. In the minds of the scribes, this random, uncredentialed rabbi from Nazareth is blatantly hijacking the authority of the Almighty. So they sit there, just inwardly accusing him of absolute blasphemy.
But then Jesus does something even wilder.
Oh, yeah.
He reads their minds. He calls out their secret internal accusations, which, by the way, demonstrates divine omniscience, which is another trait reserved only for God.
He's just layering it on.
He really is. And then he poses this brilliantly logical dilemma. He looks at these religious scholars and asks, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise and walk?
It's a total masterclass in cornering your opponent. Because if we think about the mechanics of verification here, it is infinitely easier to say, your sins are forgiven.
Why is that?
Because forgiveness is invisible.
Yeah.
It happens entirely in the spiritual realm. Nobody in that room can mathematically verify if the man's soul was actually wiped clean. So there's no physical proof to demand.
Right. You can just claim it, and nobody can definitively prove you wrong.
Exactly. But if you stand in front of a crowded room and say, rise and walk, to a man whose legs have physically atrophied,
you are immediately put to the test.
Instantly. The results are highly visible. If he doesn't stand up, you are instantly exposed as a total fraud.
So, to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he actually has the authority to do the invisible, unprovable thing, forgiving the sin, he does the visible, impossible thing.
Yes.
He tells the paralyzed man to get up, pick up his bed, and go home. And the man does it. He just gets up.
It's incredible.
But Bates highlights that Jesus drops a very specific title right before the healing.
Yeah.
He doesn't just say, I have authority. He says the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins.
And that title, oh man, that is a massive red flag to the biblical scholars sitting in that room.
Why? It sounds so mundane.
Right. It sounds like he's just saying, I'm a human.
Mm-hmm.
But he isn't using Son of Man as some poetic way of saying I'm just a regular guy.
Yeah.
He is drawing a direct, unmistakable line to the prophet Daniel, specifically chapter 7, verses 13 and 14.
Oh, right. The vision of the Ancient of Days.
Yes. In Daniel's vision, the Son of Man is a heavenly enthroned figure. This figure approaches the throne of God and is given everlasting dominion, glory, and a kingdom that will literally never be destroyed.
Wow.
So by claiming that specific title, Jesus is identifying himself as that exact cosmic world-ruling figure. But, and this is the crazy part, he's claiming he is now operating right there on the dusty floor of a house in Capernaum.
Okay, so he's established this absolute authority over invisible sin and physical paralysis. But the commentary takes us into a really, really interesting transition here.
Yeah, the narrative flows right into the next issue.
Because if Jesus really is this divine, holy figure operating on earth, how does his authority interact with the strict physical boundaries of Jewish life, and specifically the Levitical laws of ritual purity?
Right, the purity codes were everything.
And this brings us to a beautifully intertwined pair of stories. A local synagogue ruler comes to Jesus just absolutely shattered because his young daughter has just died.
A parent's worst nightmare.
Truly. So Jesus immediately sets out for the ruler's house, but on the way, he's pushing through this massive crowd, and he is intercepted by a woman who has suffered from a chronic bleeding hemorrhage for 12 years.
12 years. It's unimaginable.
And I really want to pause on the physics of holiness here, because this blew my mind when I read the source material.
It's a huge paradigm shift.
Normally, if you have a pristine, perfectly clean white shirt and you drop it into a puddle of mud, the mud doesn't magically become clean fabric.
No, definitely not.
The shirt gets ruined.
Yeah.
That is just how contamination works. The dirty thing always infects the clean thing. So according to strict Levitical law, Jesus should be the one who gets contaminated here, shouldn't he?
Under the laws laid out in Leviticus chapter 15, you are entirely correct. Because of her chronic bleeding, this woman existed in a state of perpetual ritual uncleanness.
It was constant.
Constant. And it wasn't just a medical issue. It was a profound social and religious isolation. Anything she sat on became unclean. Anyone she bumped into became unclean.
So she was totally cut off.
Completely. For over a decade, she couldn't enter the temple. She likely couldn't even hug her own family without defiling them. To use your analogy, she is the ultimate embodiment of the mud.
And she is so desperate. She sneaks up behind Jesus and just reaches out for the fringe of his cloak. Now, I remember reading in the notes that there is a very specific culturally loaded word for that fringe.
Yes, the word is tzitzit.
Tzitzit, right.
In the book of Numbers, chapter 15, Israelite men were explicitly commanded to wear these specific tassels on the four corners of their garments.
What were they for?
They were designed to be a constant physical reminder of God's commandments and the covenant with Israel. So think about the symbolism happening right here.
Okay.
This woman, who has been totally alienated by the law for 12 years, reaches out and grasps the very physical symbol of the law.
Oh, wow. And this is where the physics of holiness completely reverse.
Exactly.
Instead of her uncleanness transferring to Jesus and defiling the Messiah, instead of the mud ruining the white shirt, his life-giving, aggressive holiness flows outward.
Yes, it utterly overpowers her impurity.
It heals her body instantly, but more than that, it effectively restores her right to exist in her community again.
It proves that his holiness is not fragile.
That's a great way to put it.
It doesn't need to be protected from the broken world. It is meant to invade and conquer the brokenness. And we see the ultimate climax of this contagious authority when he finally arrives at the ruler's house.
Right, because the young girl is dead. Professional mourners are already there, weeping, playing flutes, just doing what you do when the finality of death is really set in.
And Jesus walks in, tells the mourners to leave, and just casually says the girl is merely sleeping.
Which they actually laugh at.
Yeah, because they know what death looks like. They're professionals.
But he just ignores their mocking. He takes a corpse by the hand, which again, touching a dead body was the ultimate, most severe form of ritual defilement, and he simply resurrects her.
This is the narrative escalation Bates is pointing out to us. We watched Jesus move from forgiving internal sin to curing a physical disease to reversing deeply ingrained ceremonial uncleanness. And now
he conquers death itself.
Exactly. Jesus is demonstrating that this messianic power breaking into human history possesses absolute, unrivaled authority over the ultimate curse of humanity.
Death isn't the end anymore.
Right. In the presence of this king, death is no longer a permanent, terrifying state. It is as temporary and reversible as just taking a nap.
So put yourself in the shoes of a first-century Jew watching this happen. If you know your Hebrew scriptures, these specific healings aren't just random, cool acts of magic.
Not at all.
They are flashing neon billboards pointing to a very specific identity. Which brings us to the next two miracles in the sequence. Jesus heals two blind men who explicitly yell out and call him the Son of David.
A major messianic title.
Right. And immediately after that, he casts out a demon to restore a mute man's ability to speak.
Now, to understand the weight of this, we have to look back at the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah chapter 35. The prophet is laying out a vision of what we call eschatological salvation.
And for our listeners, eschatological basically means dealing with the end times, right? Or the ultimate final destiny of the world. When God finally steps in to set everything right permanently.
Exactly. It's the ultimate climax of history. And Isaiah leaves a very explicit checklist for what that day will actually look like. He writes, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy."
He is literally checking the boxes of a centuries-old prophecy right in front of their faces.
One by one, opening blind eyes and restoring speech, they are not random choices. They are the prophesied public markers that the long-awaited Messianic age has finally dawned.
But this is the part of the commentary that I found psychologically fascinating.
Oh, the Pharisees' reaction.
Yes, because you would naturally assume that if someone fulfills a 1,000-year-old prophetic checklist with undeniable supernatural proof, everyone watching would just fall on their knees and believe.
You would think so.
But that is not how human nature works. The common crowd is amazed. They admit they've never seen anything like this. But the Pharisees, the educated religious leaders who know Isaiah backwards and forwards, they watch the mute man speak, and their final conclusion is he casts out demons by the ruler of demons.
It perfectly illustrates cognitive dissonance. The evidence sitting right in front of the Pharisees is completely undeniable.
I mean, the man is literally talking.
Right, the blind can see. But their interpretation of that evidence is entirely driven by their need to maintain control.
Ah, control.
Yeah. If Jesus is who he says he is, their entire religious hierarchy collapses overnight. They cannot deny the supernatural power, so to protect their own worldview, they have to attribute his power to a dark, satanic source.
It's really a sobering realization. Empirical proof doesn't automatically manufacture faith.
No, it doesn't.
For some people, encountering absolute, untamable authority just hardens their opposition because it threatens the tiny kingdom they've built for themselves.
That's very true.
And speaking of threatening the establishment, this is where the deep dive takes a real turn. Because Jesus doesn't just use this authority to heal physical bodies. He starts weaponizing it to heal the social order.
Yes, the narrative shifts here. We go from restoring physical bodies to the much more controversial work of restoring the covenant community itself.
And the prime, most scandalous example of this is the calling of Matthew. Jesus is just walking past a tax booth and calls Matthew, a known tax collector, to follow him.
And he just gets up and follows.
Right. Matthew abandons his post, and the very next scene, he is throwing a massive dinner banquet for Jesus. And the guest list is entirely made up of other tax collectors and societal outcasts.
A very unsavory crowd.
Exactly. Now, we need to pause and establish why this was such a nuclear scandal, because today, a tax collector is just, a guy who works for the IRS. It's annoying, maybe, but it's not a moral outrage.
The historical context is entirely different. In first century Judea, tax collectors were Jewish citizens who had essentially contracted with the brutal occupying Roman Empire.
So they were seen as traitors.
Total traitors. They colluded with the oppressors. Furthermore, their income relied entirely on extortion.
Right, they didn't have a set salary.
No, they made their living by overcharging their own starving neighbors and just keeping the extra for themselves. They were politically, morally, and religiously disguised.
So for a respected rabbi to sit down and eat a meal with them is just unthinkable, because in ancient Near Eastern culture, sharing a table with someone wasn't just like a casual lunch meeting.
Right, it wasn't just grabbing a coffee.
Table fellowship meant shared identity. You were saying, we are family, we are one.
Precisely. It implied a deep covenantal intimacy. So the Pharisees confront Jesus' disciples and just demand to know why their teacher is purposefully contaminating himself with these absolute sinners.
And Jesus overhears this, and he delivers that iconic response. Those who are healthy do not need a physician, but those who are sick do.
It's such a masterful defense. He is framing his entire ministry as a redemptive medical rescue mission.
Not a purity policing operation.
Exactly. But he doesn't stop with a clever proverb. He looks at the Pharisees, the men who have devoted their entire lives to studying the scriptures, and tells them to go and learn what Hosea chapter 6, verse 6 means.
And that verse says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice.
Yes.
He's basically telling the PhDs of biblical law that they need to go back to kindergarten because they completely missed the point of the text.
He really is. He is highlighting the ancient Hebrew concept of chesed, which translates to steadfast love or a kind of deep covenantal loyalty.
Chesed, okay.
Jesus is arguing that within God's entire plan, outward ritual observance and strict legalistic boundary keeping, they must never override redemptive mercy.
So the rules aren't the point.
Right. The true intent of the law was always to cultivate a heart of active compassion, not to build a massive system of policing who is fundamentally in and who is out.
And this paradigm shift is so massive, so completely disruptive to the way things have always been done, that even the well-meaning disciples of John the Baptist are confused by it.
Yeah, they don't get it either.
They come to Jesus and say, look, we fast. The Pharisees fast. It's a staple of being a devout Jew. Why don't your disciples observe these fasts? And Jesus answers them by calling himself the bridegroom.
Which is another heavily loaded Old Testament image.
Yeah.
Throughout the prophets, YHWH is frequently described as the husband of his covenant people.
So he's claiming that divine title again.
Exactly. By calling himself the bridegroom, Jesus is explicitly claiming that his physical presence on earth means the long-awaited Messianic wedding feast has officially started.
And you don't mourn at a wedding.
You certainly don't fast when the groom is standing right in front of you. Now, he does offer a bit of a dark foreshadowing of the cross. He hints that fasting will return when the bridegroom is forcefully taken away. But in that specific moment, the kingdom is a reality of sheer joy.
So how does Jesus ultimately explain why his new way of doing things is clashing so violently with the old religious system?
He uses a really brilliant metaphor.
Right. He gives them this everyday metaphor about wineskins. He says you don't pour new fermenting wine into old brittle wineskins.
Because if we think about the actual chemistry of winemaking here, new wine is still active. It's fermenting, bubbling, and releasing expansive gases.
It needs room to breathe.
Yes. But an old wineskin, a leather pouch that has already dried out and become rigid, it has no elasticity left. If you put dynamic, expanding new wine into a rigid old skin, the pressure will literally burst the leather, and you ruin both the container and the wine.
It is the perfect psychological and spiritual metaphor for what Matthew chapter 9 is all about.
It really sums it up.
The expansive, explosive, dynamic reality of the new covenant. This boundary-breaking, outcast-welcoming grace. It just cannot be crammed back into the old, rigid, brittle structures of legalism.
Yeah, it would destroy them.
Human psychology craves the safety of a strict checklist. But Jesus is saying his grace demands completely new, flexible containers.
The eschatological grace he is pouring out requires completely renewed people of God.
It really is just a breathtaking sequence of events when you step back and look at the whole chapter. I mean, from the paralyzed man having his deepest invisible sins wiped clean, to the woman discovering that God's holiness heals instead of condemns.
Yeah.
From blind eyes opening to see the Son of David, to a hated, traitorous tax collector hosting a feast for the Savior. Jesus is proving, miracle by miracle, that the kingdom of heaven is breaking into human history. And he's placing divine mercy at the absolute center of reality.
Beautifully said. And this brings us to a really vital question about the underlying motivation of the one who is wielding all this unimaginable power.
Right. Why is he doing it all?
At the very end of chapter 9, Bates draws our attention to a summary of Jesus' ministry. He is traveling through all the cities, teaching, proclaiming the gospel, and healing every disease. But Matthew explicitly tells us why he is pushing himself so relentlessly.
Right. There is a specific Greek word used here that Bates highlights, and it completely reframes how we view authority.
The word is Splanchnizomai.
Splanchnizomai.
Yes. The text says that when Jesus looked at the exhausted crowds, he had compassion for them. But Splanchnizomai isn't like a polite, detached, surface-level pity.
It's not just feeling bad for someone.
Not at all. The root of the word literally refers to the bowels, the internal organs.
Yeah.
It's a deep, visceral, gut-wrenching compassion. He looks at the crowds and sees them as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd.
Which is another direct pull from the prophets, isn't it?
Yes.
From Ezekiel 34, where God indicts the selfish, corrupt leaders of Israel and promises that he himself will come down and shepherd the flock.
Exactly. The absolute divine authority Jesus has been demonstrating over sin, disease, and death. It isn't about power for power's sake. It isn't a flex to demand submission.
No.
It's entirely driven by this fierce, gut-level, bleeding love for people who are broken and lost. He is the true shepherd who actually steps into the mud to rescue the sheep.
Which leaves you with something incredibly provocative to chew on as we wrap up this deep dive.
I think so, yeah.
We spent this entire time looking at Jesus' staggering authority to heal and forgive others. But I want you to think about the inherent cost of wielding that kind of contagious, boundary-breaking compassion.
There's a massive cost.
We know that new wine bursts old skins, and if Jesus is intentionally bringing the new wine of mercy into a rigid, brittle religious system, he knew exactly what the reaction would be.
He wasn't surprised by the pushback.
Not at all. He was fully aware that this relentless campaign of grace was going to violently rupture the establishment of his day, and it was inevitably putting him on a direct collision course with his own execution.
Which he embraces.
Right. We usually think of ultimate power and authority as tools we use to insulate ourselves from pain, to protect our status and to keep ourselves safe at the top of the ladder.
That's how the world uses power.
Exactly. But the ultimate authority in the universe used his power to deliberately wade into the most contaminated, dangerous, and controversial spaces imaginable, knowing it would cost him absolutely everything. True authority, it turns out, isn't about self-preservation at all. It is about radical self-expenditure.
Wow. Yeah, that changes everything.
It really does. So when you look at the areas of your own life where you hold influence or power, are you using it to build safe, rigid walls to protect yourself? Or are you willing to let your own comfort burst so that healing can reach the people who need it most?
That's a question we all need to answer.
It sure is. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time as we continue to explore the ideas that shape our world.